The first shot rang out just as Mabel Johnson collapsed to the floor, her trembling hands raised in a futile attempt to shield herself from her husband's wrath. The year was 1876, and in the small mining settlement of Copper Creek, Arizona, nobody paid much mind to a man disciplining his wife, even when that discipline left bruises that wouldn't fade for weeks. "Get up," Harold Johnson growled, towering over his wife's crumpled form. "Supper's cold again." "Can't you do anything right?" Mabel's once bright eyes, now dulled by 5 years of marriage to a man whose promises had turned to poison, stared at the rough-hewn floorboards beneath her. She was 24, though the weight of Harold's constant belittlement made her feel decades older. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words automatic now. "The stove was giving me trouble again." Harold sneered, his handsome features twisting into something ugly. At 30, he'd made a name for himself as one of the most successful merchants in Copper Creek. To the townsfolk, he was generous, charming, a pillar of the community. Only Mabel knew the monster behind the mask. "Excuses," he spat. "Always excuses with you." When they'd married in 71, Mabel had been full of dreams. The daughter of a schoolteacher, she'd been raised with books and ideas, taught to believe she could be more than just someone's wife. Harold had seemed to love that about her, in the beginning. Her spirit, he'd called it. Now he seemed determined to crush every last ember of it. "I'll heat it up again," she said, struggling to her feet, hiding the wince as pain shot through her ribs where he'd struck her the previous night. "Don't bother," Harold said, grabbing his hat. "I'm going to the saloon. Maybe they can manage to serve food that's actually warm." The door slammed behind him, and Mabel exhaled. The house fell quiet, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, a wedding gift from her parents, who'd passed away in a fever outbreak 2 years prior. Now she was truly alone. She moved to the window, watching Harold's broad shoulders as he strode down the dusty main street toward the Golden Nugget Saloon. In the dying light of sunset, Copper Creek almost looked beautiful, the rusty hues of the surrounding mountains giving the town its name. Mabel noticed a stranger riding into town tall and lean atop a dappled gray stallion. Even from a distance, there was something striking about him, something in the way he sat in the saddle as if he and the horse were one. The stranger's gaze swept across the main street before landing on her window. For a moment, their eyes met, and Mabel felt something she hadn't in years: curiosity. She stepped back quickly, chiding herself for the schoolgirl reaction. Strangers came through Copper Creek all the time. Most were heading to San Francisco or other opportunities further west. This one would likely be gone by morning. Turning back to the kitchen, she mechanically began cleaning up the dinner Harold hadn't touched. Her hands moved through the familiar motions while her mind wandered. Once she'd written poetry. Once she'd dreamed of traveling beyond these mountains. Once she'd laughed easily and often. Now she couldn't remember the last time she'd done any of those things. A knock at the door startled her from her reverie. Visitors were rare. Harold had systematically cut off most of her friendships over the years. Cautiously, she approached the door. "Who is it?" she called, her voice barely audible. "Zachary Norwood, madam," came the reply, deep and smooth as honey over gravel. "Your husband mentioned you might have a room to let." Mabel frowned. Harold had said nothing about renting out the spare bedroom, though they certainly had the space in the 2-story house he'd built to showcase his success. It would be just like him to make such an arrangement without consulting her, then blame her for not being prepared. She opened the door a crack and found herself looking up at the stranger she'd seen from the window. Up close, he was even more striking, tall and sun-bronzed, with eyes the color of a summer storm and dark hair that curled slightly where it brushed the collar of his worn denim shirt. A thin scar ran along his jawline, white against his tanned skin. "I'm afraid there must be some mistake," she said. "My husband didn't mention any border." The man's eyes, observant, intelligent, swept over her face, lingering for just a moment on the bruise she knew was blooming along her cheekbone. Something flickered in his expression, then disappeared. "Met him at the saloon just now," Zachary said, his tone casual. "Said he'd been considering letting the room for some time. We struck a deal over whiskey. I can pay a month's rent in advance." He held up a small leather pouch that clinked with the unmistakable sound of coins. Before Mabel could respond, she heard Harold's voice behind the stranger. "There you are, Norwood," Harold called, his voice carrying the false joviality he used in public. "I see you've met my wife." Harold pushed past Zachary and entered the house, giving Mabel a look that promised consequences for any perceived disobedience. "Mr. Norwood will be staying with us for a while," Harold announced. "He's invested in my store, going to help me expand the business." His eyes gleamed with avarice. "Show him to the spare room, Mabel." Mabel nodded, keeping her eyes downcast. "This way, Mr. Norwood." She led the stranger up the narrow staircase, acutely aware of his presence behind her. The spare room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a writing desk beneath the window, and a washstand in the corner. "It's not much," she said quietly. "It's more than enough, Mrs. Johnson," Zachary replied, setting his saddlebags on the bed. "I appreciate the hospitality." There was something in his tone, a gentle respect that had become foreign to her ears. When she glanced up, she found him studying her with an intensity that made her flush. "Supper's at 6, she said, backing toward the door. "Breakfast at dawn." "Thank you, madam." As she turned to leave, his voice stopped her. "Mrs. Johnson," she paused, her hand on the doorframe. "Yes, that's a mighty fine collection of books I saw downstairs. Do you read much?" The question was so unexpected it took her a moment to find her voice. "I used to," she admitted. "Not so much anymore," he nodded, as if she'd confirmed something he'd already suspected. "Shame. Nothing like a good book to keep the mind sharp." Mabel felt a strange fluttering in her chest, the ghost of who she'd once been, stirring ever so slightly. "Good night, Mr. Norwood," she said, closing the door behind her. Downstairs, Harold was waiting, his earlier public persona vanished. "What did he say to you?" he demanded, grabbing her arm hard enough to bruise. "Nothing," Mabel said quickly. "Just asked about meals." Harold's eyes narrowed. "Don't get any ideas. He's here for business, nothing more, and if I catch you making eyes at him—" "I wouldn't," Mabel whispered, the words hollow in her throat. "See that you don't." Harold released her with a shove. "Now get me a drink. And don't water it down this time." Mabel complied, as she always did. But as she poured her husband's whiskey, she found herself wondering about the stranger upstairs. There had been something in his eyes when he'd looked at her, something she couldn't quite name, but that had awoken a dangerous feeling inside her. Hope. Over the next few weeks, Zachary Norwood became a quiet fixture in the Johnson household. He rose early and returned late, supposedly helping Harold with his expanding business interests. Mabel saw little of him, but his presence changed the atmosphere in the house nonetheless. For one thing, Harold seemed to restrain himself when Zachary was around. The beatings didn't stop, but they grew less frequent, more carefully placed where clothes would hide the evidence. Harold was nothing if not conscious of appearances. One morning in late April, Mabel was gathering eggs from the henhouse when she heard the crunch of boots on gravel. She turned to find Zachary approaching, leading his gray stallion. "Morning, Mrs. Johnson," he called, tipping his hat. "Good morning, Mr. Norwood," she replied, adjusting her shawl to better cover the bruises on her arms. "Harold's already left for the store." "Actually, I was hoping to catch you," he said, coming to a stop a respectful distance away. "Got something for you." From his saddlebag he withdrew a book leather-bound and well-worn. "Leaves of Grass," he said, holding it out to her. "By Walt Whitman. Thought you might enjoy it." Mabel stared at the book as if it might bite. "I couldn't possibly, just alone," he said quickly. "I noticed you eyeing my books when you bring up my meals. This one's worth the raid." Hesitantly, she reached for the book, her fingers brushing his in the exchange. A jolt of something awareness, perhaps passed between them, and she quickly withdrew her hand, clutching the book to her chest. "Thank you," she whispered. "But if Harold sees, hide it," Zachary suggested, his voice dropping. "Read it when he's gone. It might bring you some comfort." The concern in his eyes nearly undid her. It had been so long since anyone had looked at her that way, like she mattered. "Why are you being kind to me?" she asked, the words escaping before she could stop them. Zachary's expression grew serious. "Because everyone deserves kindness, Mrs. Johnson. Especially those who receive so little of it." With that, he tipped his hat again and led his horse toward the road, leaving Mabel staring after him, the book a dangerous treasure in her hands. That night, after Harold had fallen into a drunken slumber, Mabel crept downstairs with a candle. She settled in the kitchen, far enough from the bedrooms that the faint light wouldn't be noticed, and opened the book. "I celebrate myself and sing myself," she read in a whisper, the words flowing like water over parched earth. For hours, she lost herself in Whitman's verses, feeling parts of her long-dormant soul stirring to life. When the first hint of dawn appeared on the horizon, she reluctantly closed the book and hid it beneath a loose floorboard in the pantry. As she prepared breakfast, she found herself humming softly a habit Harold had beaten out of her years ago. Quickly, she silenced herself, but not before Zachary, coming down the stairs, had heard. "That's a pretty tune," he commented, accepting the cup of coffee she offered. Mabel blushed. "My mother taught it to me. She used to sing while she cooked." "My mother was the same," Zachary said, smiling. "Said food made with music tasted better." "Mine too," Mabel laughed, the sound rusty from disuse. For a moment, they stood in companionable silence, the morning light filtering through the kitchen window casting a golden glow over everything. In that brief interlude, Mabel felt almost normal, almost free. Then Harold's heavy footsteps sounded on the stairs, and the spell was broken. Zachary moved to the table, his expression carefully neutral, while Mabel busied herself at the stove, her shoulders hunching reflexively. "Smells good," Harold grunted, taking his seat at the head of the table. If he noticed the lingering warmth between his wife and their boarder, he gave no sign. "Just flapjacks and bacon," Mabel said, serving them both before taking her own modest portion. "Norwood and I will be gone most of the day," Harold announced. "Got business in Silver Junction. Don't expect us back till late." "Yes, Harold," Mabel replied, keeping her eyes on her plate. As the men prepared to leave, Zachary paused in the doorway. "Almost forgot the latch on my window is stuck. Mind taking a look while we're gone, Mrs. Johnson?" Harold, already on the porch, didn't seem to notice the exchange. "Of course, Mr. Norwood," Mabel replied, understanding dawning. He was giving her an excuse to enter his room. Once the men had ridden off, Mabel forced herself to wait a full hour before climbing the stairs to Zachary's room. The latch was indeed stuck, and she fixed it easily enough. But as she turned to leave, she noticed a folded piece of paper on the writing desk, her name clearly visible. With trembling fingers, she unfolded it. "Mrs. Johnson," it read in a bold, clear hand. "I've left another book for you beneath the mattress. This one's by Emily Dickinson. A woman with a voice as strong as yours should be. Take courage. ZN." Mabel's heart hammered in her chest as she lifted the edge of the mattress and found a slim volume of poetry. She should leave it there. Reading Whitman was dangerous enough, but the temptation was too great. She took the book and spent the afternoon lost in Dickinson's crystalline verses, sitting in the garden where she could watch the road for Harold's return. When she finally spotted the two riders approaching in the distance, she hurried to return the book to its hiding place, her mind still echoing with words of passion and rebellion. As spring turned to summer, a dangerous pattern emerged. Zachary would find ways to slip Mabel books, poetry, novels, even newspapers from cities like San Francisco and Denver. Harold, consumed with his expanding business interests, seemed oblivious to the subtle changes in his wife. The straightening of her spine, the occasional flash of defiance in her eyes, quickly suppressed but undeniably there. In July, during a heat wave that had the whole town moving at half speed, Mabel was hanging laundry when she heard a commotion from the direction of the store. Heart in her throat, she rushed toward Main Street, joining a growing crowd outside Johnson's General Merchandise. Inside, Harold was bellowing, his face purple with rage, while Zachary stood calm and unmovable before him. "You've been stealing from me," Harold shouted, jabbing a finger at Zachary's chest. "Cooking the books, I trusted you." "I've done no such thing," Zachary replied evenly. "If you'll look at the ledger again, I've looked enough to know you're a thief and a liar." Harold's hand moved to the pistol at his hip. Mabel pushed through the crowd. "Harold, please, not here," her husband's fury redirected toward her. "You stay out of this." He grabbed her arm, yanking her forward. "Did you know? Have you been helping him?" "No, the slap came so suddenly she didn't have time to brace for it." Her head snapped back and she tasted blood where her teeth had cut into her cheek. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Zachary's hand shot out, catching Harold's wrist before he could strike again. In one smooth motion, he twisted Harold's arm behind his back, forcing him to his knees. "That's enough," Zachary said, his voice deadly quiet. "You won't lay another hand on her." The crowd murmured, shocked at the public display. Sheriff Mills pushed his way to the front. "What's going on here, Johnson?" he demanded. Harold, released from Zachary's grip, scrambled to his feet. "This man assaulted me in my own store, and he's been stealing from me for months." The sheriff looked between the two men, then at Mabel, noting her reddened cheek. "That true, Norwood?" "I haven't stolen a penny," Zachary replied. "As for the rest, I stopped him from beating his wife in public, something that should have been done long ago." The sheriff sighed, rubbing his graying mustache. "This is a domestic matter." "No," Zachary interrupted, his eyes cold as steel. "This is assault, and if the law won't address it, I will." The tension in the store was palpable. Finally, the sheriff cleared his throat. "Mr. Norwood, I suggest you collect your things and move on. Copper Creek doesn't need troublemakers." "Gladly," Zachary replied, not taking his eyes off Harold. "But I'm not leaving alone." He turned to Mabel. "Mrs. Johnson, I'm riding out this afternoon. You're welcome to join me." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. For a woman to leave her husband was almost unheard of, a scandal that would follow her forever. Harold laughed bitterly. "She won't go. She's got nowhere to go. No one wants damaged goods." Mabel stood frozen, her mind racing. To leave meant stepping into the unknown, risking destitution, social ostracism, even legal consequences. To stay meant enduring more years of Harold's escalating cruelty. "You have 1 hour to decide," Zachary said quietly. "I'll be waiting at the livery stable." With that, he strode past the gawking crowd and out into the merciless summer heat. Harold grabbed Mabel's arm, his fingers digging into her flesh. "You're not going anywhere," he hissed, dragging her toward the door. "Go home. Now." Sheriff Mills made a half-hearted attempt to intervene. "Johnson, maybe you should," "This is between a man and his wife," Harold snapped. "Stay out of it." Back at the house, Harold's rage exploded. This time he didn't bother hiding the bruises. His fists and boots found every inch of her, punishment for a betrayal she hadn't even committed yet. "You think he wants you," Harold sneered, pausing to catch his breath while Mabel curled into a protective ball on the floor. "He just wants what's under your skirts. Once he gets it, he'll toss you aside like garbage." Through swollen eyes, Mabel watched as Harold paced the room, working himself into another frenzy. When he stormed out to retrieve his whiskey from the cabinet, she made her decision. Moving as quickly as her battered body would allow, she crawled to the loose floorboard where she'd hidden her small treasures over the years, a locket with her parents' pictures, the few letters from her childhood friend in San Francisco that Harold hadn't destroyed, and the meager savings she'd managed to squirrel away from the household money. The hour was nearly up. Harold was in his study, drinking himself into oblivion. It was now or never. Slipping out the back door, Mabel made her way through the alleyways of Copper Creek, avoiding the main streets where neighbors might see and report back to Harold. By the time she reached the livery stable, she was trembling with pain and fear. Zachary was there, as promised, saddling his gray stallion. When he turned and saw her condition, his face darkened with fury. "I'm going to kill him," he growled, starting toward the door. "No." Mabel grabbed his arm. "Please, I just want to leave before he comes looking for me." For a moment, Zachary seemed torn between vengeance and escape. Then, with visible effort, he controlled himself. "Can you ride?" he asked, his voice gentle now. "Yes," she said, though in truth she wasn't sure she could stay upright in a saddle. Zachary seemed to read her doubt. "You'll ride with me," he decided, helping her onto the stallion before mounting behind her. "I've got a friend in Willow Springs, about 20 miles east. We can rest there for a few days, then decide where to go next." As they rode out of town, Mabel leaned back against Zachary's solid chest, allowing herself to be supported for the first time in years. The sun was setting, painting the desert in shades of fire and gold. Behind them, Copper Creek grew smaller, along with all the pain it represented. "He'll come after us," she said, her voice barely audible over the horse's hoofbeats. "Let him try," Zachary replied, his arm tightening protectively around her waist. "This time he'll find you're not alone." As the distance between them and Copper Creek grew, Mabel felt something unexpected beneath her exhaustion and pain, a flicker of the person she'd been before Harold, before the years of systematic destruction. That woman had been strong, curious, full of dreams. Perhaps she wasn't entirely gone after all. With that thought, Mabel Johnson closed her eyes and surrendered to the rhythm of the horse beneath her and the protective embrace of the man who had offered her a chance at freedom, a man who had seen something in her worth saving, even when she'd forgotten it herself. The journey to Willow Springs was arduous, every jolt of the horse sending fresh waves of pain through Mabel's battered body. Zachary held her steady, his arms a fortress around her, stopping frequently to let her rest and offering her water from his canteen. As night fell, they made camp in a shallow canyon, protected from view by towering red rock formations. "We should reach Jim's place by midday tomorrow," Zachary said, carefully helping Mabel down from the horse. She swayed on her feet and he caught her with gentle hands. "Easy now." He spread his bedroll beneath a juniper tree and insisted she take it, despite her protests. "I've slept on harder ground than this," he assured her, settling himself against a boulder a respectful distance away. "Try to get some rest." Mabel lay awake, watching the stars wheel overhead through the juniper branches. The night was alive with unfamiliar sounds, the yip of coyotes, the rustle of nocturnal creatures, the whisper of wind through the canyon. After years confined within the suffocating walls of Harold's house, the vastness of the open desert was both terrifying and exhilarating. "Mr. Norwood," she called softly. "Are you awake?" "Zachary," he corrected. "And yes, I'm awake. Why did you come to Copper Creek? The truth, please." There was a long silence, broken only by the pop of embers in their small fire. "I've been tracking Harold Johnson for almost 2 years," Zachary finally said, his voice low. "He isn't who he claims to be." Mabel sat up, wincing at the pain in her ribs. "What do you mean?" Zachary's face was half hidden in shadow, but she could see the grim set of his jaw. Before he was Harold Johnson, respectable merchant of Copper Creek, he was Henry Jenkins, con man and murderer. He swindled my sister out of her inheritance, then killed her when she threatened to expose him. The revelation struck Mabel like a physical blow. "Your sister, Margaret. She was a widow with a young son. Jenkins Harold courted her, married her, gained her trust. Then he systematically stripped her of everything she had." Zachary's voice was flat, controlled, but Mabel could hear the pain beneath it. When she finally realized what he was doing, she confronted him. They found her at the bottom of the stairs the next morning. "Accident," the local sheriff called it. "And her son?" Mabel asked, dreading the answer. "My nephew is safe with my parents in Montana," Zachary said. "But Margaret—" He shook his head. "I tracked Jenkins across 3 territories, lost his trail twice. Then I heard rumors about a merchant in Arizona who matched his description, a man who'd appeared suddenly with unexplained wealth and a new name. So you came to Copper Creek to— What? Kill him?" The thought should have horrified her, but Mabel found she couldn't summon any sympathy for Harold. "At first, yes," Zachary admitted. "I wanted justice or revenge if that's all I could get, but then—" "Then what?" "Then I saw you," he said simply. "And I realized Jenkins Harold was doing to you exactly what he'd done to Margaret, breaking you down piece by piece." Mabel wrapped her arms around herself, feeling exposed. "You've been watching me all this time." "Not in the way you're thinking," Zachary said quickly. "I saw the signs because I'd seen them before. The way you flinched when he entered a room, the bruises you tried to hide, the light going out of your eyes whenever he spoke to you." He paused. "I couldn't save my sister, but maybe I could help you." "By giving me books?" Mabel asked, a hint of unexpected humor in her voice. Zachary chuckled softly. "By reminding you that there's a world beyond Harold Johnson, that you have value beyond what he assigned to you." His voice grew serious again. "I saw who you really were, Mabel, even when you'd forgotten." The use of her first name sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the desert night. "And who am I, according to you?" she asked, barely breathing. "Someone brave," he said without hesitation. "Someone who survived years of torment without losing her fundamental self. Someone who still finds beauty in poetry and music, despite everything. Someone worthy of a better life than the one she's been living." Tears welled in Mabel's eyes, spilling over before she could stop them. No one had spoken to her with such respect, such genuine admiration, in so long that she'd forgotten what it felt like. "I'm not brave," she whispered. "I stayed with him. Year after year I stayed." "You survived," Zachary countered. "And when the moment came to leave, you found the courage to do it. That's not weakness, Mabel. That's strength." They fell silent, each lost in thought. Eventually, exhaustion overcame Mabel, and she drifted into the first peaceful sleep she'd had in years, lulled by the distant cry of coyotes and the reassuring presence of the man keeping watch nearby. Jim Cooper's ranch in Willow Springs was a modest, spread-a-weathered cabin, a small barn, and a corral containing a half-dozen horses in various stages of training. Jim himself was a grizzled man in his 50s, with a perpetual squint and hands calloused from a lifetime of hard work. "Zach," he greeted, stepping out onto the porch as they approached. His eyes moved to Mabel, taking in her bruised face and the way she leaned against Zachary for support. "Reckon you found what you were looking for." "Part of it," Zachary replied. "Jim, this is Mabel Johnson. She needs a safe place to stay for a while." "Madam," Jim tipped his hat. "Any friend of Zach's is welcome here." Inside the cabin, Jim's Navajo wife, Najoni, took one look at Mabel and immediately began preparing healing remedies, poultices for the bruises, willow bark tea for the pain. She spoke little English, but her gentle hands communicated compassion more clearly than words ever could. That evening, as they sat around Jim's table eating a simple but hearty stew, the older man fixed Zachary with a pointed look. "You planning to go back for him?" he asked. Zachary's eyes flicked to Mabel, then back to Jim. "Not right away. He'll be looking for us. Better to let him search in the wrong direction for a while." "And then?" Mabel asked quietly. Zachary sighed. "And then I need to see justice done for my sister. I've gathered evidence over the years enough to prove he's Henry Jenkins, enough to have him stand trial for Margaret's murder." "You mean to bring the law into this?" Jim sounded skeptical. "Law's not always kind to women in Mrs. Johnson's position." "What do you mean?" Mabel asked. Jim glanced uncomfortably at his wife before answering. "Technically, you're still his wife. In the eyes of the law, you're his property. He could claim Zach kidnapped you, and some judges would side with him." "That's absurd," Mabel protested. "I chose to leave." "Doesn't always matter," Jim said gently. "Just saying you both should be prepared for that possibility." That night, Mabel was given the small back bedroom while Zachary slept in the barn. As she lay in the unfamiliar bed, staring at the rough-hewn ceiling, she turned Jim's words over in her mind. The thought of being forced to return to Harold made her physically ill. But even worse was the thought of Zachary facing legal consequences, or worse, Harold's vengeance because of her. A soft knock at the door interrupted her spiraling thoughts. "Mabel," Zachary's voice was low. "Are you awake?" She sat up, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. "Yes, come in." He entered, holding a lamp that cast long shadows across the room. "I wanted to check on you before turning in." "How are you feeling?" "Better," she said, and it wasn't entirely a lie. Najoni's remedies had eased the worst of her pain. "Zachary," what Jim said, "don't worry about that now," he said, setting the lamp on the bedside table and perching carefully on the edge of the bed. "We have options." "What options?" "If the law won't help us, there's more than one kind of justice," Zachary said, his eyes glinting in the lamplight, "and more than one place to seek it." "What are you saying?" He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I have friends further west, California, San Francisco. People who knew my sister, who know what Jenkins did to her. If we can't get justice in Arizona territory, we'll find it elsewhere." "San Francisco," Mabel repeated, the name conjuring images from the newspapers and books she'd secretly read. A city of hills and fog, of opportunities and new beginnings. "I've always wanted to see the ocean." Zachary smiled, the expression softening the hard planes of his face. "Then that's where we'll go. But first you need to heal, and we need to put more distance between us and Copper Creek." He stood to leave, but Mabel caught his hand. "Thank you," she said, the words inadequate for the depth of her gratitude, "for seeing me, for believing I was worth saving." Zachary's fingers tightened around hers. "You saved yourself, Mabel. I just opened the door." He hesitated, then bent and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Get some rest." After he left, Mabel touched the spot where his lips had been. The simple gesture of affection more healing than all of Najoni's remedies combined. They stayed at Jim Cooper's ranch for 2 weeks, giving Mabel's body time to heal and allowing the initial search for them to die down. During that time, Zachary taught her to shoot first with a small derringer that could be hidden in a pocket, then with a Winchester repeating rifle that Jim insisted she take when they left. "Every woman should know how to defend herself," Jim said gruffly, showing her how to clean and maintain the weapon. "Especially out here." Nijoni, seeing Mabel's growing strength, began teaching her the properties of various desert plants which could heal, which could nourish, which could harm. Though they couldn't speak each other's language fluently, the two women developed a form of communication that transcended words. One evening, as Mabel helped Nijoni prepare dinner, the older woman pressed a small leather pouch into her hands. "For journey," she said in halting English. "New beginning." Inside the pouch was a small carving of a bird in flight, made of pale white stone. Mabel's eyes filled with tears as she closed her fingers around it. "Thank you," she whispered, understanding the symbolism without needing it explained. When it was time to leave, Jim provided them with fresh supplies and 2 horses, Zachary's gray stallion, Thunder, and a gentle chestnut mare for Mabel. "Her name's Penny," Jim told Mabel as she stroked the mare's velvety nose. "She's steady and smart, won't let you down." Their plan was to travel west, following the less frequented trails to avoid detection. Jim had drawn them a map marking friendly homesteads and trading posts where they could find shelter and provisions. "One more thing," Jim said, handing Zachary a folded paper. "Telegraph came for you yesterday." Zachary read it, his expression darkening. "Jenkins Herald has put a bounty on my head, $500 for information leading to my capture. Claims I stole both his wife and his money." Mabel's heart sank. "So he's still looking for us." "More determined than ever," Zachary confirmed. "We'll need to be careful." They set out at dawn, following a game trail that would eventually connect with the old Spanish trade route heading west. As the sun climbed higher, Mabel found herself reveling in the simple fact of her freedom, the open sky above her, the rhythmic movement of the horse beneath her, the absence of fear that had been her constant companion for so long. She glanced at Zachary, riding beside her with his hat pulled low against the sun. In the 2 weeks at Jim's ranch, something had shifted between them, a deepening of the initial connection, a tentative exploration of what might be possible between a woman gradually reclaiming her sense of self and a man whose quest for justice had unexpectedly led him to her. They hadn't spoken of it directly, but Mabel felt it in the lingering touch of his hand when he helped her mount, in the way his eyes sought hers across the dinner table, in the quiet conversations that stretched late into the night as they shared stories of their lives before they'd met. For the first time in years, Mabel allowed herself to imagine a future that wasn't dominated by fear and survival, a future that might include happiness, purpose, even love. As if sensing her thoughts, Zachary turned to her with a smile that made her heart skip. "Ready for an adventure, Mrs. Johnson?" he asked. She smiled back, feeling the sun warm on her face. "I believe I am, Mr. Norwood. I believe I am." Their journey west was marked by long days in the saddle and nights beneath the stars. They avoided towns when possible, making camp in sheltered canyons or beside hidden streams. When supplies ran low, Zachary would hunt while Mabel gathered the edible plants Nijoni had taught her to identify. They fell into an easy rhythm together, each discovering new aspects of the other with every passing day. Mabel learned that Zachary had been a Texas Ranger before his sister's murder had set him on his current path. He learned that Mabel had once dreamed of being a writer, filling journals with stories and poems until Harold had found and burned them all. "You could write again," he suggested one evening as they sat beside their small fire, the desert night closing around them like a velvet cloak. "I'll get you a new journal when we reach the next trading post." I wouldn't know where to begin anymore, Mabel admitted. It's been so long. Begin with this, Zachary said, gesturing to the vast landscape surrounding them. The journey, the freedom, the feeling of starting over. So he bought her a leather-bound journal at a dusty trading post near the California border. And each night after that, Mabel would write by firelight, pouring her experiences onto the page. Sometimes she would read passages aloud to Zachary, who listened with genuine interest that gradually helped rebuild her confidence in her own voice. As they traveled, Mabel noticed subtle changes in herself. Her body grew stronger from the daily riding. Her skin bronzed beneath the desert sun. The constant vigilance that had been necessary in Harold's presence began to ease, replaced by an increasing awareness of her own capabilities. One evening, as they made camp in a grove of cottonwoods beside a shallow creek, Mabel found herself studying her reflection in the still water. The bruises had faded, and with them, something of the haunted look that had lived in her eyes for so long. The woman looking back at her wasn't the same one who had fled Copper Creek a month earlier. "What do you see?" Zachary asked, coming to stand beside her. "Someone I'm starting to recognize again," Mabel replied honestly. "Someone I thought was gone forever." Zachary's gaze was warm as it met hers in the water's reflection. She was never gone, just waiting for the chance to return. Impulsively, Mabel reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. "Thank you for giving her that chance." His fingers tightened around hers, and for a long moment they stood in silence, connected by more than just their clasped hands. Then, with gentle deliberation, Zachary turned her to face him. "Mabel," he said, her name almost a caress in his mouth. "I want you to know that whatever happens when we reach San Francisco, whatever you decide to do with your life, I will respect your choice. You don't owe me anything." "What if my choice is to stay with you?" she asked, the boldness of the question surprising them both. Something flared in Zachary's eyes: hope, desire, a future neither of them had dared imagine. "Is that what you want?" he asked, his voice husky. "I'm beginning to think it might be," she admitted. "But I need time, to be sure I'm making choices for the right reasons, to know my own mind fully again." "Time is something we have plenty of," Zachary assured her, bringing her hand to his lips and pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "I'm not going anywhere." The promise in his words warmed her more than the fire beside them. That night, as they slept beneath the cottonwoods, Mabel dreamed not of the past that haunted her, but of possibilities that stretched before her like the open road they traveled. 2 days later, disaster struck. They had stopped at a small settlement to replenish their supplies before tackling the mountain pass that would lead them into California. While Zachary haggled with the storekeeper over the price of coffee, Mabel browsed the sparse collection of goods, relishing the simple pleasure of making choices, selecting a ribbon for her hair, a small bar of lavender soap, treasures that would have been forbidden under Harold's control. She was examining a display of tinned peaches when she heard a voice that sent ice through her veins. Well, isn't this a fortunate coincidence?" Mabel turned slowly to find herself facing Ezra Phillips, one of Harold's business associates from Copper Creek. A small-time gambler and occasional deputy when the sheriff needed extra hands, Phillips had always looked at Mabel in a way that made her skin crawl. "Mr. Phillips," she acknowledged, fighting to keep her voice steady. "What brings you so far from home?" His smile was predatory. "Same thing that brought you, I reckon. Your husband's mighty anxious to have you back, Mrs. Johnson, offering a generous reward, too." Mabel's eyes darted to where Zachary stood at the counter, his back to them, unaware of the threat. "I'm not going back," she said, lifting her chin. "Please, Mr. Phillips, just let us be." "Us?" Phillips' gaze followed hers to Zachary, "Ah, your rescuer, Harold mentioned him, said he'd stolen more than just his wife." His hand moved to the gun at his hip. "Think I'll collect both rewards." Before Phillips could draw, Mabel did something that would have been unthinkable mere months ago. She screamed, "Zachary, he's here for the bounty." What followed was a blur of motion and sound. Zachary spun, his hand dropping to his revolver even as Phillips drew his own weapon. The storekeeper dove behind the counter. Mabel scrambled for cover as the first shot rang out, shattering jars behind her. Zachary fired twice in rapid succession. The first bullet went wide, splintering the doorframe. The second found its mark, striking Phillips in the shoulder and spinning him around. The bounty hunter's gun clattered to the floor as he howled in pain. "Mabel," Zachary called. "Are you hurt?" "No," she gasped, emerging from behind a barrel of flour. "But we need to leave. Now." They fled the settlement, pushing their horses hard, not slowing until they were miles away. When they finally stopped to water the horses at a small spring, Mabel was trembling. "He'll tell Harold where we are," she said, pacing anxiously. "He'll send more men." Zachary nodded grimly. "We need to change our route, head north for a while before turning west again." "Will it be enough?" "It'll have to be," he said, studying the rough map Jim had given them. "There's a place here, Redemption Valley. Old mining town, mostly abandoned now. We can lie low there for a few days. Let the trail go cold." They rode through the night, following game trails and dry creek beds, avoiding the main paths. By dawn, they were deep in unfamiliar territory, the landscape growing increasingly rugged as they climbed into the foothills of the Sierra Nevada. Redemption Valley proved to be little more than a ghost town, a scattering of dilapidated buildings surrounding the entrance to a played-out silver mine. Most of the structures were unsafe, their roofs partially collapsed, but they found one cabin on the outskirts that was relatively sound. "Not exactly the Occidental Hotel," Zachary commented, surveying the dusty interior, "but it'll do for a few days." They settled in, making the cabin as comfortable as possible with their limited supplies. Zachary reinforced the door and windows while Mabel cleared away years of dust and debris. By nightfall, they had a small fire going in the stone hearth and a simple meal of beans and jerky cooking. "I'm sorry," Mabel said as they ate. "If I hadn't gone into that store, this isn't your fault," Zachary interrupted firmly. "Harold would have sent someone eventually. At least now we know they're on our trail. What if they find us here?" The fear that had begun to recede in recent weeks returned full force. Zachary's expression was resolute. "They won't. And even if they did, I won't let anyone take you back to him. I promise you that, Mabel." She believed him. Despite everything, despite the danger that seemed to be closing in around them, Mabel trusted Zachary Norwood in a way she'd never trusted anyone before, not even Harold in the beginning of their courtship. That night, with a storm gathering outside and the wind rattling the cabin's loose boards, Mabel made a decision. Life was uncertain, especially the life they were living now. Tomorrow wasn't guaranteed. All they truly had was this moment. She crossed the small room to where Zachary sat cleaning his revolver by lamplight. "Zachary," she said softly. He looked up, setting aside the gun. "What is it?" Without a word, Mabel leaned down and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was tentative at first, a question more than a statement. For a heartbeat, Zachary remained still, and Mabel feared she'd misread everything between them. Then his arms came around her, drawing her onto his lap as he deepened the kiss with a hunger that matched her own. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Zachary rested his forehead against hers. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't want you to feel I'm sure," she whispered, cupping his face in her hands. "For the first time in years, I know exactly what I want." Outside, thunder rumbled as the storm broke over the mountains. Inside, in the warm circle of lamplight, Mabel and Zachary discovered each other fully at last, not as rescuer and victim, not as avenger and witness, but as equals, as partners, as lovers who had found each other against impossible odds. As the rain lashed the cabin and lightning illuminated the rugged landscape beyond, they created a sanctuary of their own, making a place where the past could not reach them, where fear had no foothold, where two broken paths converged to form a new way forward. In the quiet aftermath, lying in Zachary's arms on their makeshift bed of blankets, Mabel felt the final pieces of her old self slotting into place alongside the new woman she was becoming. The transformation wasn't complete, perhaps it never would be, but for the first time she could envision a future unclouded by shadow. "What are you thinking?" Zachary asked, his fingers tracing idle patterns on her bare shoulder. "That I want to live," she said simply. "Not just survive. Actually live." He kissed her temple, his lips lingering against her skin. "Then that's what we'll do, together." "Together," she repeated, the word a promise and a prayer as the storm raged on around them. They remained in Redemption Valley for nearly a week, using the time to rest and plan their next move. The abandoned town offered unexpected gifts, a cache of preserved food in a root cellar, mining tools they could trade for supplies, even a few books left behind by the previous inhabitants. One afternoon, exploring what had once been the assay office, Mabel made a startling discovery: a small box containing several unclaimed gold nuggets, overlooked in the rush to abandon the failing mine. "This could help us establish ourselves in San Francisco," she told Zachary, showing him the find. "A fresh start." "Legitimate, too," he agreed. "No one's coming back for these after all these years." As they prepared to leave Redemption Valley, both felt the shift in their relationship: a deepening trust, a growing partnership that went beyond physical intimacy to something more profound. They made plans together, considering options that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. "I could write for one of the San Francisco newspapers," Mabel suggested as they packed their belongings. "Or teach. I've always loved children." "I know a man who runs a shipping business on the waterfront," Zachary said. "Jim wrote to him on our behalf before we left." There might be work for both of us. The future they were building together, word by word, dream by dream, was still fragile but increasingly real. Yet both knew that Harold Johnson's shadow still stretched behind them, a threat that wouldn't disappear until confronted. Their journey resumed with a new urgency. The mountain pass proved challenging, the trail narrow and treacherous in places. Zachary took the lead, guiding them through the wilderness with the skill of a man who had spent years living by his wits. On the western slope of the mountains, the landscape began to change, the arid terrain giving way to forests of towering pines, the air growing cooler and more humid. Mabel marveled at the transformation, filling her journal with descriptions of wildflowers she'd never seen before, birds whose songs were unfamiliar to her desert-trained ears. "Not much farther now," Zachary told her as they made camp beneath a canopy of stars more brilliant than any they'd seen on their journey. 2, maybe 3 days to San Francisco. Mabel's heart lifted at the thought. They were so close to their goal, to the new life they'd planned together. Perhaps, she dared to hope, they had outrun Harold's vengeance after all. It was a hope that shattered with the dawn. They were breaking camp, preparing for another day's ride, when Zachary suddenly stiffened, his hand going to the revolver at his hip. "Riders," he said tersely. "At least 3 coming fast." Mabel's blood ran cold. "Harold, most likely," Zachary confirmed, "or men he's hired. Either way, we can't outrun them on this terrain." Then what do we do? Panic threatened to overwhelm her, but Mabel forced it down. She wasn't the same helpless woman who had cowered before Harold's rage. She had choices now. Agency. Zachary's eyes met hers, steady and determined. We make a stand. Together. They positioned themselves among the rocks above the trail, where they had a clear view of the approaching riders. Mabel clutched the Winchester rifle Jim had given her, her heart hammering but her hands surprisingly steady. "Remember what I taught you," Zachary said quietly. "Breathe, aim, squeeze, don't pull." The riders came into view, 4 men, Harold among them. Even from a distance, Mabel could see the familiar set of his shoulders, the way he sat a horse as if he owned both the animal and the ground beneath it. The sight of him still had the power to make her stomach clench with fear, but now there was something else alongside it, anger, fierce and clarifying. "They're going to keep coming," Zachary said, his voice low, "until one of us stops them for good." Mabel understood then what he was proposing: a final confrontation, an ending to the cycle of pursuit and flight. The thought should have terrified her, but instead she felt a strange calm descending. "Then let's stop them," she said, raising the rifle to her shoulder. The first shot was hers, deliberately aimed high, a warning, kicking up dust just ahead of the lead horse. The riders pulled up sharply, scanning the rocks above them. "That's far enough," Zachary called out. "Turn back now and nobody needs to get hurt." Harold's laugh carried clearly in the morning air. "Norwood, should have known you'd be too cowardly to face me man to man." His eyes searched the rocks until they found Mabel. "And there's my wayward wife. Come down here, Mabel. This has gone on long enough." "I'm not your wife anymore, Harold," Mabel called back, her voice stronger than she'd expected. "Not in any way that matters. Go home. It's over." "It's over when I say it's over," Harold snarled, drawing his pistol. "You're my property, and I'll see Norwood hang for stealing you." "Last warning," Zachary shouted. "Ride away now, or this ends badly for you." Instead of retreating, Harold fired, the bullet ricocheting off the rocks near Mabel's position. His companions followed suit, forcing Zachary and Mabel to duck for cover as a barrage of bullets peppered their hiding place. What followed was a chaotic exchange of gunfire, the peaceful mountain morning shattered by the crack of rifles and the shouts of men. One of Harold's companions fell from his horse, clutching his leg where Zachary's bullet had found its mark. Another turned his horse and fled, apparently deciding no bounty was worth his life. Then, in a move that took everyone by surprise, Harold suddenly spurred his horse forward, charging up the slope toward their position. "He's coming for you," Zachary warned, shifting to place himself between Mabel and the approaching threat. "Get to the horses. I'll hold him off." "No," Mabel said firmly. "We face him together. That was the agreement." Harold was closer now, his face contorted with rage as he fired again and again, his shots going wide in his fury. Zachary returned fire with deadly accuracy, hitting Harold's remaining companion and sending the man tumbling from his saddle. Then, Zachary's gun clicked empty. In that moment of vulnerability, Harold charged the final distance, leaping from his horse and tackling Zachary to the ground. The 2 men rolled in the dirt, grappling for dominance while Mabel watched in horror, the Winchester heavy in her hands. Harold gained the upper hand, pinning Zachary beneath him and drawing a knife from his boot. The blade flashed in the morning sun as he raised it high. "No." Mabel screamed, bringing the rifle to her shoulder. The shot echoed across the mountainside, startling birds from the nearby trees. Harold froze, the knife still poised above Zachary's chest. Slowly, almost comically, he turned his head to look at Mabel, disbelief etched across his features. "You." He gasped, a crimson stain spreading across his shirt. "You ungrateful." He never finished the thought. With a sound like air escaping a punctured bladder, Harold Johnson, formerly Henry Jenkins, con man, murderer, and architect of Mabel's years of torment, toppled sideways and lay still. Mabel lowered the rifle, her hands shaking now that the danger had passed. Zachary scrambled to his feet and was at her side in an instant, his arms coming around her as the full weight of what she'd done crashed over her. "He would have killed you," she whispered, her face pressed against Zachary's chest. "I couldn't let him." "I know," Zachary murmured into her hair. "You saved my life. You saved both our lives." They stood like that for a long moment, holding each other as the mountain breeze stirred the pines around them. The world seemed strangely quiet after the violence, as if nature itself was taking a breath. Finally, Zachary pulled back slightly, looking down at Mabel with concern. "Are you all right?" She considered the question seriously. She had just killed a man, her husband, in the eyes of the law. Yet instead of the crushing guilt she might have expected, she felt something different: relief, liberation, the closing of a dark chapter in her life. "Yes," she said, surprising herself with the truth of it. "I think I am." They buried Harold and his companion in shallow graves marked only with rough stones. The wounded man had fled during the confrontation, and Mabel suspected they'd heard the last of him. Few would risk their lives for a dead man's vendetta. As they prepared to resume their journey, Mabel took one last look at the simple cairn that marked Harold's final resting place. She felt no need to say goodbye, no urge to offer prayers for the man who had systematically dismantled her spirit over the years of their marriage. Instead, she turned her face westward, toward the future that awaited them beyond the mountains. "Ready?" Zachary asked, holding Penny's reins for her. Mabel nodded, taking the reins and mounting in a smooth motion that would have been impossible for the woman who had fled Copper Creek months earlier. "Ready," she confirmed. "Let's go home." San Francisco in 1877 was a city of contradictions, elegant Victorian mansions standing alongside ramshackle wooden structures, cosmopolitan theaters and restaurants mere blocks from squalid tenements. For Mabel, who had spent years confined to the dusty streets of Copper Creek, the bustling metropolis was overwhelming. At first, the constant noise, the press of people, the salt-tinged air that carried the unfamiliar scent of the ocean. They found lodging in a modest boarding house in the North Beach area, run by an Italian widow named Mrs. Ferretti, who asked few questions but provided clean rooms and hearty meals. The gold from Redemption Valley, carefully exchanged at a reputable bank, gave them enough funds to establish themselves while they sought more permanent arrangements. True to his word, Zachary's contact in the shipping business offered him work overseeing warehouse security, a position that utilized his skills as a former ranger without requiring him to carry a badge. The regular income allowed them to begin building a life together, gradually replacing the temporary nature of their existence with something more enduring. For Mabel, the transition was more complex. Free from Harold's oppression, she found herself faced with an abundance of choices that was both exhilarating and terrifying. Who was she now? What did she want from this new life? The questions kept her awake at night, even as she lay safe in Zachary's arms. "You don't have to decide everything at once," he reminded her when she shared her anxieties. "We have time now, all the time you need." Gradually, Mabel began to reacquaint herself with her own interests and talents. She wrote daily, filling journal after journal with observations of city life, reflections on her journey, and the occasional poem when the mood struck. At Zachary's encouragement, she submitted a piece to the San Francisco Chronicle, a carefully fictionalized account of a woman's escape from domestic tyranny. When the editor requested more of her work, Mabel felt a surge of validation that brought tears to her eyes. Her words had value. Her perspective mattered. Piece by piece, the woman she might have been without Harold's interference began to emerge. "I've been thinking," she told Zachary one evening as they walked along the waterfront, watching the fog roll in beneath the setting sun. "About my name. What about it?" He asked, his arm comfortably around her waist. "I don't want to be Mabel Johnson anymore," she said decisively. "That was his name. I want to reclaim my own." "Mabel James," Zachary said, testing the sound of it. "It suits you." Or, she hesitated, glancing up at him. They hadn't discussed marriage, though they lived as husband and wife in all but name. Perhaps another name entirely someday. Zachary stopped walking, turning to face her fully. "Is that something you'd want after everything?" "With the right person," she said softly. "With you, yes. I think it might be." The joy that spread across his face was answer enough, but his words confirmed it. "Nothing would make me happier, Mabel. When you're ready, truly ready, I'd be honored to make a new name with you." He sealed the promise with a kiss that carried the taste of the future on it, salty like the sea air, sweet like newfound freedom, rich with possibilities yet to be explored. Fall turned to winter, winter to spring. With each passing season, the specter of Harold Johnson receded further into memory. Though Mabel knew she would never forget the lessons of those years, the vigilance they had taught her, the strength she had discovered in herself. She continued to write for the Chronicle, her articles on women's experiences in the West gaining a modest following. Zachary's position at the shipping company expanded to include management responsibilities, providing them with enough income to rent a small house on Russian Hill, with a view of the bay that never failed to take Mabel's breath away. In May of 1878, they stood together beneath a flowering cherry tree in the garden of a justice of the peace, speaking vows that held meaning beyond the traditional words. Zachary promised not only love and fidelity, but respect for her independence, recognition of her voice, support for her ambitions. Mabel, in turn, pledged herself to him not out of obligation or societal expectation, but from choice, a choice made with clear eyes and a whole heart. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the justice declared. "Mr. and Mrs. Zachary Norwood." As Zachary kissed her, Mabel felt the final piece of her transformation click into place. Mabel Norwood. A name chosen freely, an identity forged through fire and survival, a self reclaimed and rebuilt over months of patient nurturing. Their simple wedding celebration was held at a restaurant overlooking the water, attended by the friends they'd made in their new life, Zachary's colleagues from the shipping company, fellow writers Mabel had met through her work at the Chronicle, even Mrs. Ferretti from the boarding house, beaming with maternal approval. "To new beginnings," Zachary toasted, raising his glass as the sunset painted the room in shades of amber and gold. "And to the journey that brought us here," Mabel added, knowing that every step, even the painful ones, had been necessary to reach this moment of perfect contentment. Later that night, in their home with its view of the stars over the bay, Mabel stood at the window while Zachary built a fire against the evening chill. The life they had created together still felt miraculous to her, a dream she hadn't dared to dream during the darkest days of her first marriage. "What are you thinking about, Mrs. Norwood?" Zachary asked, coming to stand behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. "About how far we've come," she said, leaning back against him. "About how different everything is now." "Regrets?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. Mabel turned in his arms to face him. "Not one," she said firmly. "Every step of the way led me to you, to this life we're building. How could I regret that?" His smile was everything warmth and home and safety. "I was thinking," he said, a hint of nervousness in his tone. About the extra room upstairs, the one we've been using for storage. What about it? It might make a fine nursery. Someday, if you wanted. The suggestion sent a flutter of both excitement and apprehension through Mabel. During her years with Harold, the thought of bringing a child into their toxic household had filled her with dread. But now with Zachary. A family of our own, she said, testing the idea. I think, yes, I'd like that very much. Someday. The kiss they shared was full of promise not just for the night ahead, but for all the days and years to follow. Days that would have challenges of their own, certainly, but days they would face together, as equals, as partners in the truest sense. As Zachary led her toward their bedroom, Mabel took one last look at the starlit bay below. From the ashes of her broken spirit, something new and beautiful had emerged, not despite the hardship, but because of it. She had been remade, piece by piece, day by day, through Zachary's patient belief in her worth and her own determination to reclaim herself. And in that remaking, she had found not just healing, but joy, a joy she carried forward into the waiting arms of the man who had seen her true self, when even she had forgotten it existed. The following years brought changes both expected and surprising. Mabel's writing career flourished, her articles expanding from the Chronicle to publications across the country. She developed a particular interest in advocating for women trapped in abusive marriages, using her platform to argue for legal reforms that would offer them greater protection and autonomy. Zachary, supportive as always, encouraged her increasingly public role, even when it sometimes drew criticism from more traditional quarters. "Your voice matters," he would remind her when discouragement threatened. "You're speaking for women who can't speak for themselves." In the spring of 1880, their family grew with the birth of their son, Thomas James Norwood, named for Zachary's father and Mabel's maiden name. Motherhood brought a new dimension to Mabel's healing journey, allowing her to create the nurturing family environment she had been denied in her first marriage. "He has your eyes," Zachary said the day Thomas was born, cradling their newborn son with a tenderness that made Mabel fall in love with him all over again. "And hopefully your spirit. And your steadfastness," Mabel added, "your integrity." Together, they built a home filled with books and music, laughter and honest conversation, everything that had been absent from the house in Copper Creek. As Thomas grew from infant to toddler to curious young boy, Mabel watched with pride and wonder, grateful beyond words for the second chance that had brought her to this life. When Thomas was 3, an unexpected letter arrived from Jim Cooper. The grizzled rancher had news. Ezra Phillips, the bounty hunter who had confronted them years earlier, had recently died in a bar fight in Tucson. Among his effects had been a wanted poster for Henry Jenkins Harold's true identity, along with notes about the man's suspected whereabouts in Copper Creek. "Seems the law finally connected some dots," Jim wrote. "Too late for Jenkins himself, but they're looking into his dealings now. Might be some folks who lost money to him could get some justice at last." The letter brought the past rushing back, not as a threat, but as a reminder of how far they had come. That evening, after Thomas was asleep, Mabel and Zachary sat on their small porch overlooking the city, the letter between them on the table. "Does it bother you?" Zachary asked. "Thinking about him again?" Mabel considered the question, searching her heart for the truth. "Not in the way it once did," she said finally. "It feels distant now, like reading about someone else's life." "You've come a long way from Copper Creek," Zachary observed, taking her hand. "We both have." "We had to," Mabel said simply. "Otherwise he would have won even in death." Their conversation was interrupted by a small voice from the doorway. "Mama, Papa, I had a bad dream." Thomas stood there in his nightshirt, his dark hair tousled, his eyes so like Mabel's wide with the lingering fear of childish nightmares. Zachary scooped him up without hesitation. "What was it about, little man?" "Monsters," Thomas mumbled, burying his face in his father's neck. "Under my bed." "Well now," Zachary said seriously, "that's something we should investigate right away. Monsters have no business in this house." As Zachary carried their son inside to conduct a thorough monster hunt, Mabel remained on the porch for a moment longer, gazing at the city lights twinkling below. The contrast between her past and present struck her anew, the terrified woman hiding from her husband's rage versus the confident mother and writer she had become. The journey between those two versions of herself hadn't been easy or straightforward. There had been nightmares, moments of panic when a loud noise or sudden movement triggered memories of Harold's violence. There had been days when self-doubt had threatened to overwhelm her, when the habits of submission ingrained over years had been hard to break. But through it all, Zachary had been patient, steadfast in his belief in her strength even when she wavered. Not fixing her, she hadn't needed fixing, but creating the safe space in which she could heal herself, reclaim her voice, rediscover her courage. Inside, she could hear Zachary's voice, deep and reassuring, as he checked beneath Thomas's bed and inside his wardrobe, declaring the room officially monster-free. Her son's giggles followed, the simple joy of feeling safe in his father's presence. That was Zachary's gift, Mabel realized, not just to her, but to everyone he loved. The ability to make them feel secure, valued, worthy of protection, not because they were weak, but because they were precious. She joined them in Thomas's room, sitting on the edge of the bed as Zachary told an improvised story about a friendly dragon who scared away all the monsters in the kingdom. Thomas's eyes grew heavy as he listened, his small hand clutching Mabel's, until finally he drifted back to sleep. As they tiptoed from the room, Zachary's arm came around her shoulders, drawing her close. "What were you thinking about out there?" he asked. "You had that far-away look." "About journeys," Mabel said. "About how sometimes the longest distance isn't measured in miles." Zachary nodded, understanding as he always did. "The distance from who you were to who you are now." "Yes." She leaned into his embrace, grateful beyond words for his presence in her life. "And about how some journeys are only possible because someone believes in you enough to show you the way." "You showed yourself the way, Mabel," he corrected gently. "I just walked beside you." In the quiet of their home, with their son sleeping peacefully, and the past reduced to nothing more threatening than words on paper, Mabel knew he was both right and wrong. She had found her own strength, her own path forward. But she had found it because Zachary had seen what Harold had tried so methodically to destroy, the essential core of who she was, the spirit that could bend but never truly break. Year by year, piece by piece, he had helped her rebuild what had been damaged, not by doing the work for her, but by holding space for her to do it herself. And in that rebuilding, she had become not just whole again, but stronger at the broken places, more fully herself than she had ever been before. "I love you," she told him, the words simple but carrying the weight of everything they had survived together, everything they had built, everything they still had to look forward to. "And I love you," he replied, sealing the declaration with a kiss that held the taste of home and safety and all the tomorrows yet to come. Always. By the summer of 1885, the Norwoods had firmly established themselves in San Francisco society, not among the wealthy elite, but within the vibrant community of writers, artists, and progressive thinkers that gave the city its unique character. Their home on Russian Hill had become a gathering place for intellectuals and activists, particularly those involved in women's causes. Mabel's writing had evolved from newspaper articles to more substantial work. Her first book, Broken Cages, Women's Voices from the Frontier, collected the stories of women who had survived domestic abuse and rebuilt their lives. Though controversial in some circles, the book received critical acclaim and established Mabel as an important voice in the growing movement for women's rights. Zachary, meanwhile, had partnered with his employer to open a security consulting firm that specialized in protecting commercial shipments, a business that capitalized on his experience while allowing him to maintain his principles. His reputation for integrity made the firm successful, providing the family with comfortable financial security. Thomas, now 5, had been joined by a sister, Eleanor, a precocious 2-year-old with her father's storm-gray eyes and her mother's determined spirit. The children filled the house with noise and movement, bringing a joyful chaos that sometimes left Mabel marveling at the fullness of her life. One evening in late August, as they prepared to host a dinner party for some of Mabel's literary colleagues, a messenger arrived with a telegram. Zachary read it with a frown that gradually transformed into astonishment. "It's from Jim Cooper," he told Mabel, who was arranging flowers in the dining room. "He's coming to San Francisco, arriving next week." "Jim? Here?" Mabel was equally surprised. The rancher had rarely left Arizona territory in all the years they'd known him. "Why?" Zachary handed her the telegram. "Says he has news that's best delivered in person, and he's bringing Nijoni." The prospect of seeing their old friends again filled Mabel with both excitement and trepidation. Jim and Nijoni represented a bridge to their past, to the dangerous days of flight and fear that now seemed like another lifetime. "We'll make up the guest room," she decided. "It will be good for the children to meet them." The reunion proved joyful, if somewhat awkward at first. Jim had aged visibly, his hair now completely silver, though he still carried himself with the same no-nonsense directness they remembered. Nijoni had weathered better, her dark eyes as keen and observant as ever as she took in the Norwoods' home and family. After dinner, once the children were in bed, Jim finally revealed the purpose of their visit. "There's been developments back in Arizona," he said, accepting the whiskey Zachary offered. "About Jenkins Harold as you knew him." Mabel tensed, her hand finding Zachary's on the sofa beside her. "What kind of developments?" "Well, first off, they found his first wife," Jim said. "Or rather, she found them, came forward after reading about the investigation in the newspapers." Zachary sat up straighter. "His first wife? Before Margaret?" Jim nodded. "Seems our friend was quite the serial offender. Married her in '65, right after the war. Started showing his true colors pretty quick. She managed to escape him in '68, just before he met your sister. She's alive." Zachary's voice held a mix of shock and relief. "All this time?" "Living under a different name in Colorado," Jim confirmed. "Changed her appearance, too. Smart woman. She heard about Jenkins' death and the investigation and decided it was finally safe to tell her story." Mabel leaned forward, a journalist's instinct for important details asserting itself. "What's her name now? Where in Colorado?" "That's the other reason we're here," Jim said, exchanging a glance with Nijoni. "Her name is Catherine Wilson now. She's a schoolteacher in Denver, and she wants to meet you both." "Why?" Mabel asked, though she thought she already knew the answer. "Because you're the only other people who truly understand what she survived," Jim said simply. "And because she's writing a book about Jenkins and his crimes, wants your perspectives for it." The revelation landed like a stone in still water, ripples of implication spreading outward. A book about Harold, about Henry Jenkins, would mean revisiting the darkest chapter of their lives. It would mean questions about how he had died, about their flight across the desert, about all the things they had tried to put behind them. Yet even as these concerns surfaced, Mabel felt something else rising alongside them, a sense of purpose, of responsibility to other women who might be facing similar situations. "I think we should meet her," she said, looking to Zachary for his reaction. If her book could help even one woman recognize the signs before it's too late. Zachary squeezed her hand, his expression thoughtful. "It would mean going public with everything. Are you prepared for that? For the questions? The judgment?" Mabel considered this. They had built a respectable life in San Francisco. While their close friends knew aspects of their history, the full story remained private. Making it public could have consequences, particularly for their children. "We don't have to decide tonight," Jim interjected. "Catherine's in no rush. She's been working on this project for years, gathering accounts from other women Jenkins victimized before his death." "How many?" Zachary asked hoarsely. "At least 5 that she's confirmed," Jim replied. "All following the same pattern: charm, isolation, control, violence." Jenkins had it down to a science. Najoni, who had been silent throughout the conversation, suddenly spoke, her accent still thick but her English much improved since Mabel had known her. "Bad spirit, that man," she said firmly. "Story needs telling. Drive away more bad spirits." The simple wisdom in her words resonated with Mabel. Perhaps this was the final step in her healing journey, not just rebuilding her own life, but helping to ensure that Harold's pattern of destruction ended with him. "I'll write to her," Mabel decided. "We can at least hear what she has in mind." Later that night, after Jim and Najoni had retired to the guest room, Mabel and Zachary sat in their bedroom, discussing the implications of Catherine Wilson's project. "Are you sure about this?" Zachary asked, his concern evident. "It would mean reopening old wounds." Mabel moved to the window, gazing out at the city lights. "I'm not sure they ever fully closed," she admitted. "And maybe that's as it should be, not to live in the past but to honor it, to acknowledge how it shaped us." Zachary joined her at the window, his arms encircling her waist from behind. "You've come so far," he said softly. "Sometimes I look at you the way you are with the children, the confidence in your writing, even the way you move through a room, and I can hardly believe you're the same woman I met in Copper Creek." "I'm not," Mabel said simply. "That woman died somewhere between Arizona and California, but the woman I've become carries her memory, honors her survival." She turned in his arms to face him. "Just as you carry Margaret's." Zachary nodded, pain briefly shadowing his features at the mention of his sister. "I've often wondered if she would approve of how everything turned out, if justice was served by what we did." "Not justice," Mabel corrected gently. "Survival, protection, prevention of further harm." Justice would have been Harold facing a judge and jury for his crimes against Margaret, against me, against all the others. What we did was necessary. The distinction seemed to ease something in Zachary's expression. "You always did have a way with words," he said, the corner of his mouth lifting in a smile. "One of the many things you helped me rediscover," Mabel reminded him, rising on tiptoe to kiss him softly. Their conversation was interrupted by a small sound from the doorway. Alina, thumb in mouth, clutching her favorite blanket. "Bad dreams, sweetheart?" Zachary asked, crossing to scoop up their daughter. Alina nodded solemnly, her gray eyes wide in the lamplight. "Monster," she whispered. Mabel exchanged a glance with Zachary, remembering similar nights with Thomas. "Should Papa check for monsters?" she asked, smoothing Alina's dark curls. But Alina shook her head. "Want Mama to check. Mama's brave." The simple childish faith in those words brought tears to Mabel's eyes. To her daughter, she wasn't a victim, a survivor, a woman who had once been too terrified to speak above a whisper. She was simply Mama, strong, capable, brave enough to chase away monsters. Yes, she agreed, taking a leaner from Zachary's arms. Mama will check. And then we'll have a story, shall we? As she carried her daughter back to the nursery, Mabel felt Zachary's gaze following them, proud, loving, and still, after all these years, tinged with the wonder of a man who recognized the miracle of healing when he saw it. The correspondence with Catherine Wilson evolved over the following months, gradually transforming from formal exchanges about her book project to something more personal, a connection between two women who had survived the same man's brutality and emerged stronger for it. In the spring of 1886, Catherine finally made the journey to San Francisco, arriving with a trunk full of research materials and a quiet determination that reminded Mabel of herself. Though physically unlike, Catherine was tall and fair where Mabel was petite and dark, the women recognized in each other a kindred resilience. "I never thought I'd meet someone else who truly understood," Catherine confessed during her first evening in the Norwood home. "Who knew exactly what it was like. The way he could change in an instant," Mabel agreed, "charming one moment, monstrous the next. The isolation," Catherine added, "how he cut us off from anyone who might have helped. The way he made us doubt our own minds," Mabel continued, "until we no longer trusted our perceptions." They talked long into the night, comparing experiences separated by years but identical in pattern. Zachary, listening quietly, was struck by the systematic nature of Jenkins' abuse, the calculated way he had selected and broken his victims. "It was never random," Catherine explained. "He chose women with certain qualities: intelligence, independence, spirit. Breaking those qualities seemed to be part of the satisfaction for him. He told me once that he enjoyed watching the light go out in my eyes," Mabel said softly. "As if it were a game to him." Catherine nodded grimly. "For him, it was. A game he'd perfected over years of practice." Over the next 2 weeks, the three of them worked together on what had become a joint project, not just Catherine's book, but a comprehensive documentation of Jenkins' methods and the patterns that might help other women recognize similar predators before it was too late. Mabel contributed her writer's skill, helping to shape the narrative for maximum impact. Zachary added his investigative expertise, organizing the evidence they had collected about Jenkins' movements and identities over the years. Catherine brought her educator's perspective, developing frameworks to present the information clearly and accessibly. The project became a final step in healing for all of them, a way to transform their individual suffering into collective purpose. By exposing Jenkins' methods, they hoped to strip similar abusers of their power, which relied heavily on secrecy and isolation. When Catherine returned to Denver to complete the manuscript, she left behind not just a collaborator but a friend. "We'll continue this work," she promised Mabel at the train station. "In different cities, different ways, but toward the same end. Freedom," Mabel said, embracing her, "for all the women still trapped where we once were." The publication of The Predator Among Us, the true story of Henry Jenkins and his victims, in early 1887, created exactly the stir they had anticipated. Conservative reviewers denounced it as scandalous and inappropriate for public consumption. Progressive publications hailed it as a groundbreaking exposure of domestic tyranny. Women across the country wrote letters to the authors, some sharing similar experiences, others expressing gratitude for the warning signs outlined in the book. For the Norwoods, the public attention required adjustments. There were uncomfortable questions at social gatherings, concerned inquiries from the parents of their children's friends, even a few canceled dinner invitations from more conservative acquaintances. But there were also new allies, women's rights advocates who sought Mabel's perspective for their campaigns. Legal reformers interested in Zachary's insights on how the law had failed Jenkins' victims. Fellow writers who recognized the courage it had taken to tell such a personal story. Through it all, Zachary remained Mabel's steadfast support, just as he had been since that first meeting in Copper Creek. Their partnership, forged in crisis and deepened through years of mutual respect, stood as living proof of what Mabel had come to believe most firmly, that the human spirit, though it could be broken, possessed a remarkable capacity for healing when nurtured with patience and love. In the autumn of 1890, 14 years after Mabel had fled Copper Creek with nothing but the clothes on her back and a desperate hope for something better, the Norwoods celebrated the opening of Haven House, a shelter for women escaping abusive situations, funded by the proceeds from Catherine's book and Mabel's subsequent writings. Located in a renovated Victorian on the edge of San Francisco's Mission District, Haven House offered not just physical safety but practical assistance, legal advice, employment connections, childcare, and the emotional support of others who understood the journey from victim to survivor. On opening day, Mabel stood on the porch of the newly painted building, watching as city officials, journalists, and supporters gathered for the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Beside her, Zachary rested his hand at the small of her back, a gesture of support that had become so familiar over the years that she sometimes wondered how she had ever stood upright without it. "Are you ready for this?" he asked quietly. Mabel nodded, taking in the scene before her. Thomas, now 10, helping his sister Alina arrange flowers on the welcome table. Jim and Najoni, who had relocated to California the previous year, directing volunteers. Catherine, who had traveled from Denver for the occasion, chatting with potential donors. "More than ready," she replied. "This feels like completion somehow." Zachary's smile held understanding. "The final piece of rebuilding, exactly." Mabel turned to face him fully. "You know, when I left Harold, I thought I was broken beyond repair. That the best I could hope for was to escape with what little of myself remained." "I remember," Zachary said softly. "You could barely look me in the eye. And now look at us." Mabel gestured to the gathering, to their children, to the house that would offer other women the chance she had been given. All of this grew from those broken pieces. "Not just from the broken pieces," Zachary corrected. "From your courage. From your unwillingness to let him define you forever." Mabel shook her head, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "No, from us. From what we built together." She took his hands in hers, remembering all the times these same hands had steadied her, supported her, helped her find her way back to herself. "You never tried to fix me, Zachary. You just believed I could fix myself, and that made all the difference." As they stood together on the threshold of this new chapter, Mabel reflected on the long journey that had brought them here, from the dusty streets of Copper Creek to this moment of public triumph. From a marriage that had nearly destroyed her to one that had helped her become more fully herself than she had ever thought possible. The path had not been straight or easy. There had been setbacks along the way, nightmares that still occasionally disturbed her sleep, moments when an unexpected trigger would bring the past rushing back, days when the weight of all she had survived threatened to overwhelm her. But through it all, there had been Zachary, patient, steady, believing in her even when she doubted herself. Year by year, day by day, sometimes moment by moment, he had helped her rebuild what Harold had systematically destroyed. Not by doing the work for her, but by creating the safe space in which she could do it herself. Not by telling her who she should be, but by reminding her of who she had always been beneath the fear and pain. "Mrs. Norwood," the mayor's assistant approached, clipboard in hand. "We're ready to begin the ceremony whenever you are." Mabel nodded, squeezing Zachary's hands once more before releasing them. "I'm ready," she said, and the words carried the weight of everything that had brought her to this moment, the darkness she had survived, and the light she had found beyond it. As she stepped forward to address the gathered crowd, Mabel felt Zachary's presence behind her, solid, supportive, unwavering as always. The sun caught the silver now threading through his dark hair, the lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of both laughter and concern over the years they had shared. Looking out at the faces turned toward her, her children, their friends, the women who would find refuge in this place, Mabel began to speak, her voice clear and confident, carrying easily across the hushed gathering. "Haven House stands today as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit," she said. "To its capacity not just to survive darkness, but to emerge from it stronger, more compassionate, more determined to create light for others." As she continued her speech, Zachary watched with pride and a deep, abiding love that had only grown stronger over the years. The woman before him bore little resemblance to the frightened creature he had first met in Copper Creek, the woman whose spirit had been so systematically broken that she had almost disappeared entirely. This Mabel stood tall, her voice carrying conviction, her eyes clear and direct as she spoke of hope and healing, of second chances and new beginnings. This Mabel had not just survived. She had transformed her pain into purpose, her personal healing into a mission to help others find their way to freedom. And in that transformation, Zachary knew, lay the most profound victory over Henry Jenkins and all the Harold Johnsons of the world. They could break bodies, they could even temporarily break spirits, but they could never destroy the essential core of the women they targeted, not when those women found the courage to leave, the support to heal, and the strength to rebuild themselves piece by piece. As Mabel concluded her speech, and the ribbon was cut, officially opening Haven House to those who would seek sanctuary within its walls, Zachary moved to her side once more. Together, they watched as visitors began to explore the building, as their children proudly showed off the rooms they had helped decorate, as the dream they had nurtured together became reality. "You did it," he said softly, his arm slipping around her waist. Mabel leaned into his embrace, her heart full beyond measure. "We did it," she corrected, looking up at the man who had helped her rebuild not just her life but her faith in her own worth. "Together." And in that moment, surrounded by the family they had created and the community they had built, Mabel knew with absolute certainty that while Harold had indeed broken her spirit year by year, Zachary had spent every year since rebuilding it not into a replica of what had been destroyed, but into something stronger, deeper, more authentically herself than she had ever been before. It was a rebuilding that would continue for all the days of their lives together, not because the work was incomplete, but because growth itself was endless, the human spirit constantly evolving, reaching always toward light and love and the fullest expression of its potential. And that, Mabel reflected as she stood beneath the autumn sun with her husband's arm around her and their children's laughter in her ears, was perhaps the greatest gift Zachary had given her, not just the chance to heal from the past, but the freedom to step into a future limited only by the breadth of her own dreams.